Fabulous. I'm really excited to be here today. So many people in the room and just in the conference in general that I haven't had a chance to see face to face since before COVID, so it's an absolute delight. Love to just start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land that we meet today, and also acknowledging any traditional owners that are with us in the room here, and all of the traditional owners that work with us both in Australia and internationally. Just incredibly grateful for the wisdom, the partnership, and the work that we're able to achieve together. So today I'm not Anna Marsden, so I'm Teresa Fife, and I lead the conservation portfolio work within the foundation, but I do spend a fair chunk of my time actually in the fundraising space. So I'll try and do Anna's presentation justice today. So just wanted to start, I don't think I need to give any background to the foundation. You all know who we are and what we do. But since 2000, we've secured over $440 million in investment. Now that is not just direct cash. So on our website, we've got our collaborative investment strategy, and it describes how we talk about our investment, and we talk about co-investment. So that's actually funding that comes from all of you, from our partners who co-invest in the work that we fund. It comes from corporates, it comes from individuals, and it comes from philanthropy. $350 million has been secured in the last 5 years, and that has been largely off the back of the Reef Trust partnership, and neither of those two figures include any of the government money that went for the partnership itself. We're finding that there's a building of momentum for investing in oceans, particularly in the philanthropic space. And interestingly, I think there's a number of factors that are driving that. One of them is undoubtedly that, every week there's a story about another incident, either a cyclone, a bleaching event, or something impacting coral reefs. And so there's a crisis, and crises, it's devastating, but it does have an impact often at mobilising investment. The second piece is we've seen a real shift in donors that historically played in the humanitarian or in that kind of social impact space. And they're really seeing coral reefs and oceans now as a humanitarian crisis. So what that means is that there's a lot more donors out there that are not just in that kind of purist, if you think about sort of Gordon Betty Moore, those really traditional kind of ocean funders. You've got much more non-traditional funders that are wanting to contribute funds to the cause. And it is welcome because I'm sure most of you know, but SDG 14 receives the lowest funding out of all of the Sustainable Development Goals. Collaborative investment strategy, I mentioned, we have all of our targets on our website, but under the government grant, we had a target of $357 million. A big proportion of that is co-investment from partners. But what I wanted to really show was, I guess, how it spread out across the components, because it didn't land, I think, in necessarily how we thought. The only area that we weren't able to date, generate private or corporate funding from has been the Crown of Thorns starfish space, but we continue. There is general interest in the innovation space, but when it comes to actually killing creatures, it's a little bit of a more difficult value proposition. But if you have a look at the leveraged funds and you look at something like in the community reef protection space, basically the $10 million in that grant's returned $39 million in largely co-investment and some private donations. But a lot of that, the way in which we calculate the co-investment, we've got set figures that people can use, for example, for volunteer hours. So it's quite a robust framework. And I think we all know inherently that in community, there is a huge value add and there is a huge investment that community makes, but I think it's rarely acknowledged. So to kind of see that the area in which we've actually got our highest return is coming through that community space. Philanthropy. So we're seeing the gift size increase and really think that again is driven by multiple factors. It's driven by the fact that we are seeing the ocean and the coral reef cause becoming more of interest, and there is no doubt that philanthropy is growing. So the number of philanthropists globally and the amount of funds that they have to liberate each year is enormous. What they are missing for the most part is really large pipelines of projects to invest in. If you want to invest $100 million or $500 million or $1 billion, that's a big pipeline. And as Cedric said, there aren't a lot of NGOs that are playing in this game at the size, have a pipeline that can actually match that. So that's a challenge that we have. There is a lot of investment, but how do you actually unlock that investment? The US, again, it will be unsurprising. They have a very strong philanthropic giving culture, but again, they're extremely wealthy. People is growing in the US. Some of the major insights, and some of this has shifted quite a bit. So we're finding that collaborations are what donors want, and we are more and more being asked when we're asked to put forward a proposal to a donor. They'll say to us, okay, well, we're already funding this work in reef restoration with this partner, and so you need to create a consortium and come together. So we're really seeing that competition isn't an attractive proposition to these investors. They really, really want to see collaboration. There's a shift from MPA, just funding MPAs, and a lot of, again, those donors that have spent the last 30 years just funding MPA work are now funding more in the adaptation and intervention space. No surprise, First Nation and Pacific projects are growing in attraction, and it's because there's recognition that no one knows the local context like local communities and First Nations people. And if you want to get enduring outcomes from the impact and the work that you do, it has to be embedded within local contexts. And technology and innovation, it remains dominant, and it's been a steady investment stream for a long time. Corporate partnerships, so for those of you that knew the foundation before the RTP, so we've been around for 25 years, our primary investment stream before the Reef Trust partnership was actually through corporate partnerships. So it's been a big part of our overall funding strategy. They are, what we're seeing in the corporate space is we're seeing a shift away from things like investing in sport to actually investing more in causes that align with their ESG priorities, not in terms of delivering on the ESG priorities. And there is a very strong line that needs to be drawn, and Cedric mentioned the greenwashing issue in his talk. You know, there have now been companies prosecuted under the new greenwashing rules, and so it's driving a really favourable shift in terms of corporates understanding that they need to make a very significant investment into something that is going to deliver meaningful impact, and they need to be prepared to take a back seat in terms of the kudos and the communications that comes with that. And so, you know, we're seeing less and less, which is great, of corporates that are expecting to have their corporations being endorsed by not-for-profits, but rather talking about the work and the partnerships that are happening and the impact that they're delivering. Again, I've covered off on that second piece. The Great Barrier Reef is a very hot property in terms of investors, and so this is coming through stakeholder and shareholder surveys that corporates are doing, where they're kind of saying, you know, here's a whole range of different environmental causes. What are you finding as the most important? And time again, the Great Barrier Reef comes up first. Yeah, and I think this last one is interesting. We're trying to get the balance right here, because if you look at something like CCIP, the COTS Control Innovation Program, or RRAP, clearly you need to have a really strong R&D base in order to get meaningful deployment. And so we've been working, I guess, in an education context with donors to be, you can't just go and fund the cool stuff on the ground, because if that's not evidence-based and embedded in strong science and in local contexts, then it's not going to be enduring. And so we're trying to kind of set up a model by which we encourage our corporate partners to invest in both the deployment and the R&D and the locally led traditional owner engagement activities. Just going to close with 3 case studies. They're all quite different, and Cedric mentioned the Morova partnership and the L'Oreal, the Fund for Nature there. At the same time as we're negotiating that deal for the biodiversity credit, which did take quite a long time, because working in that biodiversity credit space, it's so new. And so it was the first deal that they had sort of done, and certainly the first that Morova had undertaken in the marine space. But simultaneously, we were talking to their Garnier sort of team within L'Oreal, and were able to have, as part of the funding, They fund the biodiversity credit. They provide a chunk of funding for some R&D, but then there's also a clip off the ticket of every product that's sold that then goes into reef restoration more broadly. You might have seen that. That was quite a big activation, so all the Coles supermarkets had that for quite a while. The McLaren Racing, I mean, those of you that are in the RAP team will know this well. This is, has become, I think, a really high-profile one. The backstory is that there was a Zac Efron television documentary about reefs. It had some work that was showing corals being zip-tied with plastic zip ties onto structures. And so we literally had the head of McLaren F1 send an email to our info@Barrier Reef email address saying, why are you using plastic zip ties on the reef? We've got better products than that. And that started a conversation internally between GBRF and McLaren. And where it has landed is that McLaren has a program called Accelerate, and that's really looking at how do they harness the power of their incredible supply chain to drive costs down in whatever process it is that you're looking at improving. And so we've asked them to have a look at the semi-automated aquaculture processes from within RAP and look at where are the cost efficiencies and looking at kind of driving down the cost of producing a single coral kind of tenfold over the next 2 years. So there's been some great media that's been generated. Both Cedric and Anna were out on the reef with Oscar Piastri. I don't follow F1 at all, so I had no idea, but apparently people tell me that was a big deal and that people were falling over themselves to actually want to be on this particular famil. But it's just, you know, what I'm trying to show with these examples is that there's more than just cash investment. So you get cash investment, you get introduction to, you get the know-how, you get introduction to network, but you also get channel, and the channel to amplify messaging, which is really, really important. They can reach a whole lot more people than any of our organisations can. Forex, kind of changing tack, the support our Reef Sink a Schooner initiative. So, you know, love it or hate it, Forex is a Queensland icon. And so it's been a fantastic partnership, a really, really great partnership. And it actually started through our water quality area, and they're funding a project looking at automated irrigation systems, and it was a really interesting donor journey because we were kind of talking about they really wanted to have a partnership profiling farmers and the great work that farmers are doing in terms of improving the health of the Great Barrier Reef. But it wasn't until we actually had some conversations with some farmers and they were saying, you know, this automated irrigation system is actually going to change our life. Because our manual systems mean we've got to get up sometimes twice a night, like actually down to different parts of the paddock to change over our irrigation system. And so it's become kind of a mental health and wellbeing issue. And that really resonated. They were like, oh, wow, this isn't just about, you know, improving productivity of farms and improving outcomes for the Great Barrier Reef. We're actually improving the wellbeing of our farmers who, you know, backbone of the supply chain in Australia. So they've done loads and loads and loads of marketing, and again, you would have seen that promotion coming out on, and it was great. And the farmers who often see themselves as being vilified in terms of the impacts that they've had on the reef, where individual farmers that are just doing over and above could actually be profiled, and be profiled by a company that resonated with them. That was really, really important. So right now, there's a 50 cents a schooner on for a current fundraising opportunity. And I'm just going to end on this, and I'll leave this up for people to have a look at. It's actually more to do with community, much more about community sentiment than it is about fundraising. But we find people really interested in what does the everyday Australian kind of think about when it comes to coral reefs and the Great Barrier Reef. And just at the highest level there, you know, where we've seen the shift. We did a sentiment survey back in 2020, 2021. And people knew that the Great Barrier Reef was under threat, but they couldn't actually name the threats, or when they did, they were kind of random things like sunscreen or things that really weren't in the top 5 of reef threats. Going back in 2023, and this included focus groups, it was only within Australia, but it was Australians generally, Queensland, and then reef kind of heartland. Every single one of the groups could actually name specific threats. And so it kind of showed that awareness is getting through. They understood the urgency. collaboration and action is what gave them hope. And a number of researchers within RAP I know have had a look as well as that same thing. You want to motivate people, you have to give them something that they can do. How can they be a part of it? And you also have to show, talking about bleaching, what is all the things that we're actually doing to try and move the needle. And lastly, just that in all of the consumer surveys that we did, science was still held up really, really high. And that hasn't been the case throughout. You know, we know there's some challenges in the water quality space, and you know, some of that has been challenged. But the everyday Australian sees the science, loves the breakthroughs. So that's kind of the fundraising stuff in a nutshell. Thanks, Jim.